the morning of July 14th, 1944. Somewhere in the Norman countryside, beneath a sky still hazy from the previous night's artillery exchange, a Sherman tank sits motionless at the base of an earthen wall. The engine idles. Inside, the crew waits. Outside, a small group of officers and enlisted men stand with their arms crossed, some smoking, most skeptical. They've seen too many failed solutions to get their hopes up about another one. At the front of that Sherman, welded crudely to its lower glacis plate, are 4 steel prongs scavenged, ugly, asymmetrical. They look like something a farmer might have cobbled together, not something that belongs on 30 tons of American armor. The man who built them stands off to the side, a staff sergeant named Curtis Coolin, and he's probably more nervous than he's ever been in his life, because if this doesn't work, he's going to look like a fool. And if it does work, well, he might just change the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tank lurches forward. The prongs bite into earth and root. The engine roars, treads churn, and then the hedgerow tears open like fabric. The Sherman pushes through, staying level, gun forward, ready to fight. 10 seconds. The kind of breakthrough that had been costing American lives for 6 weeks just happened in the time it takes to light a cigarette. Someone in that small crowd exhales a long breath. Someone else mutters something unprintable. And Curtis Coolin, the cab driver from Cranford, New Jersey, has just solved one of the most vexing tactical problems of the entire Normandy campaign with scrap metal and a welding torch. But to understand why this moment matters, why this crude device would be rushed into production and mounted on over 500 tanks in less than 2 weeks, you have to understand what the hedgerows of Normandy had done to the American army. You have to understand the trap that modern mechanized warfare had stumbled into, and the medieval landscape that had turned the most mobile military force in history into a bleeding, frustrated infantry slog. The beaches of Normandy, stormed on the 6th of June, 1944, had been costly, but ultimately successful. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, each had been taken, and the Atlantic Wall, that vaunted German defensive line, had been breached. In the first 48 hours after D-Day, Allied planners had allowed themselves a moment of cautious optimism. The foothold was established. The build-up of men and material was proceeding ahead of schedule. Breakout seemed inevitable. And then the army moved inland, into the bocage. The word itself is deceptively gentle. Bocage. It sounds pastoral, almost poetic. In reality, it described a landscape that had been shaped by 1,000 years of Norman agriculture into something that might as well have been purpose-built to destroy tanks. Every field in the Normandy interior, and there were thousands upon thousands of them, was surrounded by an earthen bank, typically 4 to 6 feet high, packed dense with centuries of accumulated soil. On top of these banks grew hedges of oak, beech, elm, and hawthorn, rising another 6 to 15 feet, their root systems intertwined with the earth below like natural rebar. These weren't the manicured hedges of an English garden. These were ancient, gnarled, impenetrable walls of vegetation, some of them older than the discovery of America. The Norman farmers who had built these boundaries over generations had done so for practical reasons: to mark property lines, to contain livestock, to break the wind. They had not intended to create a defensive network, but that's exactly what they had done. Each hedgerow enclosed a small field, typically no more than 100 yards across. Each field became, in military terms, a separate compartment. An invading force could not see from one field to the next, could not maneuver, could not bring its superior firepower to bear in any kind of coordinated way. The bocage turned warfare into a series of isolated, close-range fights, and it neutralized almost every advantage the Americans possessed. The Germans understood this immediately. General Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending France against the inevitable invasion, had identified the bocage as ideal ground to bleed the Allies. Unlike the open tank country of North Africa, where mobility and firepower decided battles, the Norman hedgerows forced the Americans to fight on German terms. Every hedgerow became a fortified position. Every field became a killing box. German infantry could dig in at the base of one hedgerow, with a clear field of fire across the enclosed space, and wait. When American forces tried to advance, they had to cross open ground under direct observation and fire. And when American armor tried to follow, the hedgerows stopped them cold. The tactical problem was simple to describe and seemingly impossible to solve. A Sherman tank approaching a hedgerow had 3 options, and all of them were bad. Option 1. Try to blast through with the main gun. High explosive shells would detonate against the hedge, sending up impressive clouds of dirt and splinters, but the earthen bank beneath, packed solid over centuries, absorbed the blast. Even multiple shells couldn't reliably blow a gap wide enough for a tank to pass through. The hedgerows simply swallowed the explosions. Option 2. Use explosive charges. Engineers could place satchel charges or Bangalore torpedoes at the base of a hedgerow and blow a gap. This worked, technically, but it was slow, dangerous, and required infantrymen to cross open ground under fire to place the charges. German machine gunners and mortar teams had long since learned to target these engineer teams. Casualty rates among combat engineers in the bocage were catastrophic. Option 3, and this was the option that tank crews tried most often, because it seemed like it should work, was simply to drive over the hedgerow. After all, a Sherman weighed 30 tons. Its engine produced 400 horsepower. It should, in theory, be able to climb a 6-foot earth bank and push through some bushes. In practice, here's what happened. The tank would approach the hedgerow and begin to climb. As the front of the hull tilted upward, climbing the bank, the entire underside of the tank became exposed. The belly armor of a Sherman was the thinnest on the entire vehicle, only half an inch of steel plate, because designers had assumed that threats would come from the front and sides, not from below. As the tank crested the hedgerow, teetering on top of the earthen bank, its vulnerable belly was exposed at an angle, sometimes nearly vertical, to any German soldier with an anti-tank weapon in the next field over. A single Panzerfaust, the German, shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket could penetrate that belly armor easily. One shot. The tank would brew up, as the crews called it, flames roaring through the interior as ammunition cooked off. Even if the crew managed to bail out, they were doing so in the middle of a hedgerow, silhouetted against the sky, easy targets. And even if no anti-tank weapon fired, even if the tank made it over the hedgerow intact, it entered the next field in the worst possible tactical position. The tank would nosedive down the far side of the bank, front end pointed at the ground, gun unable to depress far enough to engage targets at the base of the opposite hedgerow. For several long seconds, the tank was effectively blind and helpless. German infantrymen learned to wait for that moment. Wait for the American tank to lurch over the hedgerow, wait for it to drop nose first into the field, and then open fire not at the tank, but at the infantry following behind it. Without infantry support, the tank had to reverse back over the hedgerow or advance alone into concentrated fire. The bocage had turned the most powerful armoured force ever assembled into a grinding, murderous stalemate. Tank commanders were reporting 80% losses in some units. Infantry casualties were mounting at rates that hadn't been seen since the trench warfare of the First World War. By the end of June 1944, just 3 weeks after the triumphant landing, American forces were losing approximately 5,000 men per week in the bocage and advancing at a rate of barely a mile per day. Morale began to crack. Tank crews, already dealing with the knowledge that German tanks like the Panther and Tiger outgunned and out-armoured them, now faced the additional horror of being sitting ducks every time they approached a hedgerow. Some crews refused to advance. Others crept forward with such extreme caution that offensive momentum disappeared entirely. Infantry units, watching their supporting armor get destroyed or stalled, began to lose faith in the entire concept of combined arms warfare. Senior officers were desperate. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, later wrote that the bocage problem haunted his planning throughout June and into July. The breakout operation, codenamed Cobra, was being planned for late July, and its success depended entirely on being able to move armour rapidly through the Norman countryside once the German defensive line was breached. But if every hedgerow required a separate battle, if every field had to be cleared individually, there would be no breakout. There would only be more bleeding. Various solutions were attempted. Some units tried using tanks as mobile artillery, sitting back and pounding hedgerows with high explosive shells before infantry advanced. This helped, slightly, but was ammunition-intensive and slow. Other units experimented with bulldozer tanks, Shermans fitted with bulldozer blades to try to push, through hedgerows by sheer force. The bulldozer tanks worked, but they were rare, specialized vehicles, and they couldn't be everywhere at once. Engineers tried different explosive techniques, different charge placements, different timing. Nothing changed the fundamental equation. Hedgerows stopped tanks, and stopping tanks killed Americans. Into this situation 6 weeks of mounting casualties, mounting frustration, mounting pressure to find a solution, stepped a man who had no business solving the problem because he wasn't supposed to be thinking about it in the first place. Staff Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. was 29 years old in the summer of 1944. He was attached to the reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armoured Division's 102nd Cavalry Squadron. His job, in theory, was to scout ahead of the main force, to gather intelligence, to probe enemy positions. He wasn't a tank crewman. He wasn't a combat engineer. He wasn't an ordnance specialist or a PET, research and development officer. Before the war, he'd driven a taxi in Cranford, New Jersey. His military value came from his ability to weld and his willingness to fix whatever needed fixing in the field. But Curtis Cullen had been watching. For weeks, he'd been watching tanks fail at hedgerows. He'd been watching good crews die because 30-ton machines couldn't get past centuries-old farming boundaries. And like many good soldiers who see a problem that needs solving, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The conventional approaches blasting through, climbing over, weren't working. That much was obvious. But what if, Cullen wondered, you didn't try to go over the hedgerow at all? What if you went through it? Not through the hedge itself, but through the base, through the earthen bank that gave the hedgerow its strength? The idea was almost embarrassingly simple, the kind of solution that made you wonder why nobody had thought of it before. Take heavy steel beams and weld them to the front of a tank at a downward angle, like tusks, like the prongs of a plough. When the tank approached a hedgerow, those prongs would dig into the base of the earthen bank, and the tank's forward momentum would tear through the roots and packed soil. The tank wouldn't climb up and over, it would cut through and push forward, staying level the entire time. Keeping the tank level meant keeping the belly armour protected. It meant keeping the gun in a position to fire. It meant entering the next field ready to fight, not nose down and vulnerable. The whole thing could be fabricated from scrap metal. It didn't require new technology or complex engineering. It just required someone to actually build it and see if it worked. Cullen started scrounging for materials. The Normandy beaches were still littered with German defensive obstacles, the steel hedgehogs and Belgian gates that had been supposed to stop the invasion on D-Day. These were made of heavy structural steel, angle iron, I-beams, exactly the kind of material Cullen needed. There was a certain poetry to it, he might have thought. German steel that had failed to stop Americans on the beach would now help Americans break through German defences inland. He found a Sherman tank whose crew was willing to let him experiment. Using a cutting torch and welding equipment, Cullen fabricated 4 steel prongs, each about 3 feet long, angled downward at roughly 40 degrees. He welded them to the lower front hull of the Sherman, extending forward like the tusks of some mechanical animal. The welds were crude, done in field conditions with whatever equipment was available. The prongs themselves were asymmetrical, uneven. The whole contraption looked, frankly, ridiculous, like something a desperate farmer might bolt onto a tractor, not something that belonged on a weapon of war. When Cullen showed his invention to his immediate superior officers, the response was not encouraging. "It won't work," one officer reportedly said. "The steel will just bend when it hits the hedgerow." "It'll slow the tank down," said another. "Extra weight on the front, It'll throw off the balance. What happens when the prongs get caught in the roots? A third asked. The tank gets stuck, and now it's a stationary target with a bunch of metal sticking out the front for German gunners to aim at. Some of the criticism came from a place of genuine technical concern, but some of it, Cullen must have sensed, came from a different place entirely. Here was an enlisted man, a reconnaissance sergeant, a cab driver in civilian life, claiming to have solved a problem that had stumped trained engineers and senior officers for weeks. The implicit audacity of that was almost offensive. If the solution were really that simple, wouldn't someone with more expertise have thought of it already? But Cullen had one significant advantage in this bureaucratic resistance. He had already built the thing. He wasn't proposing a theoretical solution that would require months of development and testing. He was standing next to a Sherman tank with steel prongs welded to its front, and he was saying, "Let me show you." Someone history doesn't record exactly who made the decision authorized a field test. Perhaps they thought it would fail and put the matter to rest. Perhaps they were curious enough to give it a chance. Perhaps, after 6 weeks of mounting casualties, they were willing to try anything, no matter how improvised or unlikely. The test was scheduled for July 14th, 1944. A section of bocage terrain was selected, the kind of hedgerow that had been stopping American armor for weeks, thick, ancient, with roots penetrating deep into a 6-foot earthen bank. A small crowd gathered to watch, officers from the 2nd Armored Division, tankers, engineers, and of course Curtis Cullen himself, probably smoking and definitely nervous. The Sherman with the welded prongs was positioned at the base of the hedgerow. The crew climbed in, the engine rumbled to life. Someone gave the signal, and the tank surged forward. The steel prongs bit into the base of the earthen bank. For a moment, maybe half a second, there was resistance, the sound of roots beginning to tear, the engine straining. And then the hedgerow simply gave way. The prongs ripped through the packed earth and root system like a plough through soft ground. Dirt and vegetation flew to either side. The tank pushed forward, staying level, gun pointed straight ahead, and emerged into the next field in the fighting position. The entire process took perhaps 10 seconds. The crowd of observers stood in silence. Some had seen hundreds of tanks try and fail to cross hedgerows. They had seen tanks explode, had seen them get stuck, had seen crews die, and now they had just watched a Sherman tear through a hedgerow as if it weren't even there. Someone again. History doesn't record who broke the silence with profanity. The sentiment was echoed by others. The test was repeated because one success might have been a fluke. The tank backed up, repositioned, and attacked another hedgerow. Same result. Rip, tear, push through. 10 seconds. It worked. Curtis Cullen's ugly, improvised, ridiculous-looking device actually worked. Word of the successful test spread quickly through the division. Within 24 hours, it had reached the desk of Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. And Bradley, commanding the First Army and under immense pressure to break out of the Normandy stalemate, understood immediately what he was looking at. Bradley had been planning Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive, for weeks. The operation called for a massive aerial bombardment to shatter the German defensive line, followed by a rapid armoured exploitation to race through the gap before the Germans could regroup. But the plan had a critical vulnerability. Even if the bombardment succeeded, even if a gap was opened, American armour still had to cross the bocage. And if every hedgerow remained an obstacle, if progress remained measured in yards per hour instead of miles per hour, the Germans would have time to seal the breach. The offensive would bog down, just like every other offensive had bogged down in the hedgerows. Cullen's device, which someone had already nicknamed the Rhino because of its horn-like prongs, offered a solution. If Sherman tanks could rip through hedgerows at will, if they could maintain momentum through the bocage instead of stopping at every field boundary, then the breakout might actually work, might actually become the kind of mobile, fast-moving offensive that armoured warfare was supposed to enable. Bradley ordered an immediate demonstration. He watched personally as a Rhino-equipped Sherman tore through hedgerow after hedgerow. He asked technical questions. How much did the device weigh? How long did it take to fabricate? Could it be standardized? Could it be mass-produced? In the field? The answers were encouraging. The prongs added only about a ton of weight, negligible for a 30-ton tank. Fabrication took a team of welders, perhaps 6 to 8 hours per tank. The design was simple enough that it didn't need to be standardized. Units could adapt it based on available materials. Bradley made his decision immediately. He issued orders on July 17, 1944. Every available ordnance and maintenance unit in Normandy was to begin fabricating hedgerow cutting devices for as many Sherman and Stuart tanks as possible. Priority was maximum. Operation Cobra was scheduled to begin within the week, and Bradley wanted as many Rhino tanks as could possibly be produced before then. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What followed was one of the most impressive examples of improvised military production in the entire war. Ordnance. Companies across Normandy dropped their normal maintenance schedules and focused entirely on fabricating hedgerow cutters. Welders worked 18-hour shifts. Scavenging teams combed the beaches for German steel obstacles, stripping them down and hauling the metal inland. Some units, running short of beach obstacles, began cutting up destroyed German tanks and vehicles for their steel. The design evolved slightly as different units experimented. Some versions had 4 prongs, some had 6, some had steel teeth added for better cutting, but the basic concept remained Culins. The speed of production was remarkable. Within 1 week of Bradley's order, over 200 tanks had been equipped with hedgerow cutters. Within 2 weeks, the number exceeded 500. Tank crews, initially skeptical of the ugly devices welded to their hulls, quickly became believers after seeing them in action. Morale improved noticeably. Tankers who had been refusing to advance, who had been creeping forward with suicidal caution, suddenly had confidence again. The hedgerows were no longer impassable obstacles. They were just terrain. Operation Cobra was launched on July 25, 1944, after weather delays pushed back the original date. The operation began with one of the largest aerial bombardments of the war. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 350 medium bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of explosives on a 5-mile stretch of the German 8-2. The bombardment was supposed to annihilate German defences and create a clear path for the armour to exploit. The bombardment succeeded, partially. It inflicted heavy casualties on German units and disrupted their communications and command structure, but it didn't annihilate them. German soldiers, dug deep into the bocage, survived in surprising numbers, and the bomb craters and rubble actually made some areas more difficult for tanks to traverse, not easier. Under the pre-Rhino conditions, this might have been enough to stall the offensive. American armour would have faced intact hedgerows combined with bomb-damaged terrain, and progress would have slowed to the same bloody crawl that had characterized the previous 6 weeks. But the Rhino tanks changed the equation entirely. As American armour pushed forward on July 25th and 26th, they encountered hedgerows, but the hedgerows didn't stop them. Rhino-equipped Shermans tore through field boundaries at 10 times the speed that had been possible before. What used to require engineers placing explosives, infantry suppressing German positions, and tanks waiting vulnerable and exposed, now took seconds. A Rhino tank would hit a hedgerow at speed, rip through, and emerge ready to fight. German defensive positions that relied on the bocage for protection suddenly found themselves flanked, surrounded, bypassed. German after-action reports from this period expressed genuine confusion. The Americans, who had been so predictably slow in the bocage, who had been stopped cold by every hedgerow, were suddenly everywhere at once. Defensive positions that should have held for hours were being overrun in minutes. The carefully prepared bocage defense, which had worked so well for 6 weeks, was collapsing. First-hand accounts from American tankers described the transformation. Captain James Burt, commander of a company in the 66th Armoured Regiment, later wrote, "Before the Rhino, attacking through the bocage felt like fighting blind. You'd crest a hedgerow and drop into the next field with no idea what was waiting for you, your gun pointed at the dirt. With the Rhino, you punched through at speed, and you were in the next field ready to fire before the Germans knew what was happening. It was like someone had turned on the lights in a dark room. Another tanker, whose name was not recorded but whose account was preserved in divisional records, described it more bluntly. We went from feeling like we were going to die at every goddamn hedgerow to feeling like we couldn't be stopped. That's not an exaggeration. That's what the Rhino did for us psychologically. We believed we could win again. The numbers tell the story in cold terms. In the 6 weeks between D-Day and Operation Cobra, American forces in Normandy advanced approximately 25 miles inland from the beaches, averaging less than a mile per day, at a cost of over 30,000 casualties. In the week following the launch of Cobra, American forces advanced over 30 miles, and the rate of advance accelerated daily as the German defensive line collapsed. By early August, American armor was racing across France at speeds that hadn't been seen since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. The breakout wasn't solely due to the Rhino tanks, of course. The aerial bombardment, the numerical superiority of Allied forces, the gradual attrition of German combat power, all of these factors contributed. But the Rhino was the tactical innovation that made rapid movement possible. Without it, Operation Cobra might have succeeded eventually, but it would have been a slow, grinding success, giving the Germans time to establish new defensive lines further inland. With the Rhino, the breakout became the kind of explosive, decisive offensive that strategic planners had hoped for. German prisoners captured during the breakout were asked about the sudden American success. Some attributed it to overwhelming numbers or air superiority factors that had been present all along, but others specifically mentioned the American tanks' newfound ability to move through the bocage. One German officer, captured in early August, reportedly said, "We couldn't understand how your tanks were suddenly able to cross the hedgerows so quickly. We had been told the bocage would stop you. It had been stopping you. And then, it didn't anymore." The irony embedded in this success is worth examining. The United States military in 1944 was the most technologically advanced fighting force in human history. American industry was producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons at rates that staggered the imagination. American research and development programs were pioneering radar, computing, and nuclear physics. The Manhattan Project alone employed over 100,000 people working on the most advanced scientific endeavor ever attempted, and yet, when it came to solving the hedgerow problem, a problem that was killing thousands of Americans and threatening to derail the entire Normandy campaign, the solution didn't come from a research laboratory or an engineering corps. It came from a cab driver with a welding torch. The military establishment had overcomplicated the problem. They had assumed that a solution would require sophisticated technology, extensive testing, and formal development programs. They had assigned engineers to study the hedgerows, had experimented with specialized equipment, and had written reports and proposals. And while they were studying and proposing, Curtis Cullen simply built something and tried it. This wasn't because Cullen was smarter than the engineers or more capable than the officers. It was because he approached the problem without preconceptions about what a solution should look like. He wasn't constrained by doctrine or procedure. He saw a functional problem tanks need to get through hedgerows and devised a functional solution. The solution wasn't elegant or sophisticated. It was crude and practical, but it worked. Cullen's invention also reveals something about the nature of military innovation in general. Institutions, by their nature, tend to favor established methods and proven technologies. They're slow to adopt radical changes because radical changes carry risk, but warfare, especially modern warfare, is fundamentally unpredictable. No amount of pre-war planning can anticipate every tactical problem that will arise in actual combat. The armies that succeed are the ones that can improvise, that can encourage and reward innovation from unexpected sources, that can recognize a good idea even when it comes from a cab driver instead of a laboratory. The U.S. Army, to its credit, recognized the value of Cullen's invention immediately once it was demonstrated. Bradley didn't hesitate. He didn't commission a study or form a committee. He saw that it worked and ordered mass production. This kind of institutional flexibility, the ability to bypass normal channels when circumstances demand it, is rare in military organizations. The fact that it happened in this case probably saved thousands of American lives and shortened the war in Europe by weeks, possibly months. Curtis Coulin himself was promoted to technical sergeant and awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention. The official citation praised his ingenuity and initiative in solving a critical tactical problem. But the recognition, while genuine, was also somewhat perfunctory. Coulin wasn't paraded through Washington for newsreels. He wasn't featured in major magazine articles. His invention was documented in military records and technical manuals, but he remained, to the broader public, largely unknown. After the war, Coulin returned to civilian life. He settled in Ringoes, New Jersey, and worked various jobs, none of them particularly notable. In the few interviews he gave in later years, he was characteristically modest about his invention. When asked how he had come up with the idea, he would shrug and say something like, "I just watched what the tanks were doing wrong and thought about how to fix it." He didn't consider himself a hero or an inventor in the grand sense. He had seen a problem that needed solving, and he had solved it. That was all. Coulin died on March 13, 1963, at the age of 50, in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service and noted that he had developed a device to help tanks cross hedgerows in France during World War II. That single sentence was the extent of public recognition for an invention that had changed the course of the Normandy campaign. The Rhino tanks themselves had a longer legacy. By the end of the war, thousands of Allied tanks had been equipped with hedgerow-cutting devices based on Coulin's original design. The basic concept, forward-mounted prongs to cut through obstacles, became standard doctrine in American armored forces. Variations of the design appeared in post-war military equipment, including specialized engineer vehicles and mine-clearing tanks. The principle that Coulin had demonstrated, that sometimes brute force applied correctly is more effective than sophisticated technology applied poorly influenced military engineering for decades. Today, several surviving Rhino tanks are preserved in museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays a Sherman with original hedgerow cutter, prongs. The Musée Mémorial d'Omaha Beach in Normandy has a similar example. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans includes a detailed exhibit on the bocage fighting and features a replica Rhino device that visitors can examine up close. These museum pieces, with their crude welds and asymmetrical prongs, look primitive compared to modern military technology. They look like exactly what they were: improvised solutions created in the field under desperate circumstances. But that crudeness is precisely what makes them significant. They represent a moment when individual ingenuity trumped institutional inertia, when a simple idea proved more valuable than complex planning, when a sergeant with a welding torch accomplished what trained engineers could not. The broader lesson of the Rhino tank extends beyond military history. It's a lesson about how innovation actually happens in practice, as opposed to how we imagine it happens. We tend to think of innovation as a formal process. Identify a problem, assign experts, develop solutions, test rigorously, implement carefully. And sometimes innovation does work that way. But just as often, maybe more often, real innovation comes from unexpected sources. From people who aren't constrained by established thinking. From solutions that seem too simple to work until someone actually tries them. Curtis Coulin wasn't supposed to solve the hedgerow problem. He wasn't qualified by institutional standards. He wasn't in the right position. He wasn't part of the official effort to find a solution. But he solved it anyway, because he was paying attention and because he was willing to try something, even if it made him look foolish if it failed. The story also reveals something about the nature of warfare itself, particularly modern mechanized warfare. For all the sophisticated technology, for all the careful planning and doctrine, war remains fundamentally unpredictable and improvisational. The German hedgerows hadn't changed in centuries. They were ancient agricultural features, not military obstacles. but they defeated American armor more effectively than any German tank design. The solution to this medieval problem didn't come from advanced technology. It came from crude, steel, and practical thinking. German military theorists, writing after the war, often cited the bocage fighting as an example of terrain negating technological superiority. They were right, but only partially. The bocage negated American technological superiority for 6 weeks. Then an American sergeant negated the bocage with an invention that took less than a day to build. The lesson isn't that terrain trumps technology, or that technology trumps terrain. The lesson is that adaptability trumps everything. The hedgerow cutter also demonstrates a principle that military historians sometimes call good enough engineering. The rhino wasn't perfect. It added weight to the front of the tank. It created visual targets for enemy, gunners. It sometimes broke or bent under heavy use and needed field repairs, but it was good enough. It worked well enough to solve the immediate problem, and that was what mattered. Waiting for a perfect solution, for an elegantly engineered device that addressed every possible concern, would have meant more weeks of casualties and stalemate. Cullen's imperfect solution, implemented immediately, saved lives and won battles. This principle that a working solution now is worth more than a perfect solution later is often forgotten in modern military acquisition. Programs stretch across years or decades, trying to develop weapons systems that excel in every possible scenario. Costs balloon. Timelines slip. And meanwhile, soldiers in the field make do with equipment that doesn't quite fit their needs. The Rhino tank stands as a reminder that sometimes the best solution is the one that works today, even if it's not the one that looks best in a PowerPoint presentation. The human element of the story is perhaps most striking. Curtis Cullen didn't invent the hedgerow cutter because he was trying to win medals or advance his career. He invented it because he was frustrated, because he was watching men die unnecessarily, because he couldn't stand seeing the same problem occur over and over without someone trying something different. That frustration, that refusal to accept the unacceptable, drove him to act when others remained passive. How many other soldiers in Normandy that summer must have thought about the hedgerow problem? How many must have wondered if there was a better way? Probably thousands. But most of them didn't do anything about it. They weren't welders. They weren't in a position to experiment. They assumed someone else, someone more qualified, was working on it. Cullen was different. He had the skills, the materials, and the stubbornness to actually try his idea. That combination skill, opportunity, and determination is what separates those who solve problems from those who merely identify them. The story of the Rhino tank has been told before, but it's rarely been told with the emphasis it deserves. Military histories of Operation Cobra focus on the strategic planning, the aerial bombardment, the movements of divisions and corps. The hedgerow cutter gets mentioned, usually in a footnote or a brief aside, as one of several factors that contributed to the breakout. But this understates its importance. Without the Rhino, Operation Cobra might still have succeeded, but it would have been a different kind of success, slower, bloodier, less decisive. Curtis Cullen changed the war in a way that few individual soldiers ever do. He didn't capture an enemy position single-handedly. He didn't lead a dramatic charge. He didn't perform an act of extraordinary courage under fire. He just solved a problem that needed solving. And in doing so, he demonstrated that sometimes the most important military innovations come not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Not from the laboratory, but from the field. Not from the career officer, but from the cab driver who knew how to weld. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.